Julian Hayes never expected that coming home early would change everything. For months, his mansion in Greenwich had felt more like a monument to loss than a place to live until the afternoon he walked in and heard his sons laughing for the first time since their mother died. Following the unexpected sound, he discovered Sienna Brooks, the new caregiver, on the floor playing with them in a way he hadn't seen in months. In that moment, Julian realized his broken family had just been given a spark of life he thought was gone forever. Julian Hayes had grown used to waking up each morning feeling as if someone had reached into his chest and taken something essential. Before the accident, he had been a man fueled by purpose, meetings, deadlines, innovation, the constant hum of ambition that had driven him from a tiny apartment in Chicago to a mansion overlooking the Long Island Sound. But ever since the night he lost his wife, Harper, he moved through life as if every action required twice the effort it used to. His success felt distant now, almost irrelevant, compared to the weight that pressed on him every day he opened his eyes and remembered she was gone. In the months after her death, the Greenwich house transformed from a home buzzing with life into something much harder to face. The children's toys still sat in woven baskets near the living room fireplace. Harper's favorite knit throw still lay folded over the arm of the couch, untouched because Julian refused to move anything she'd last touched. Even the lingering scent of her perfume in the master bedroom felt like a reminder of a life that had slipped through his hands before he ever had a chance to bargain for more time. He stopped sleeping there altogether, choosing instead the couch in his office, where exhaustion eventually forced his body to rest even if his mind kept fighting. Most mornings he would wander into the kitchen before the sun came up. Not because he had slept well, but because lying still for too long gave him too much space to think. He would stand over the sink, drinking coffee that tasted bitter no matter how he prepared it. On the counter sat Harper's last grocery list, the one she wrote before the accident, still taped to the fridge, edges curled from months of being left untouched. It read strawberries, yogurt, batteries, don't forget the boys' vitamins. He could never bring himself to take it down. That small, everyday handwriting once made him feel anchored, now it haunted him with a softness he couldn't bear to lose. Every corner of the house reminded him of something he no longer had the strength to hold. On the shelves in the hallway were framed photos, from happier times, family trips to Lake Tahoe, birthdays with superhero-themed cakes. Harper laughing while trying to wrangle the triplets into matching pajamas. Julian couldn't bring himself to take the pictures down, but he also couldn't bring himself to truly look at them. Memories were supposed to bring warmth. Instead, they felt like openings in his armor, places where pain could seep through too easily. The hardest part wasn't the house or the memories. It was the three boys who depended on him in ways he didn't feel equipped to handle. Caleb, Asher, and Finn, 5-year-old triplets with the same blonde curls but completely different personalities, had once filled their days with questions, inventions, and giggles that echoed down the hallways. Since losing their mother, they had withdrawn into themselves. They stayed close to one another, rarely reaching for him the way they once reached for Harper. They had begun to navigate the world in their own tight triangle, communicating in glances and half-spoken words, leaning on each other because the one person who could comfort them best was the one person they could no longer touch. Julian tried. He read every book on childhood grief, scheduled weekly sessions with a child psychologist in Westport, reorganized their routines, changed their meal plans, introduced new toys, new games, anything that might stir a little joy back into their days. But each attempt ended the same way, with Julian sitting alone at night, convinced he was failing them in every imaginable way. He had built a multi-billion-dollar corporation, but he couldn't figure out how to help 3 little boys get out of bed without looking lost. Work, once an escape, became another burden he couldn't manage gracefully. The Manhattan headquarters of Hayes Dynamics felt too bright, too sharp, too full of people expecting him to be the man he used to be. During meetings, executives would speak cautiously, their voices dipping whenever the subject touched anything remotely stressful. Investors whispered concerns about his focus. Emails piled up, unread, because Julian couldn't keep his thoughts steady enough to move from one task to the next. Some days he sat behind his desk for hours, staring at reports that might as well have been written in another language. Other days he left early, claiming he had somewhere important to be, when in reality he simply couldn't stay another minute. The commute home always felt longer than it should. The closer he got to the stone driveway lined with maples, the heavier he felt inside. He dreaded stepping through the front door, not because he didn't love his sons, but because he feared facing the version of himself that lived there, the version that had failed to save the woman he loved, the version that had to pretend he was strong because 3 small boys took cues from every expression he made. His mother-in-law, Evelyn Monroe, tried her best to help. She was the one who finally insisted he hire a new caregiver, someone who could provide structure and companionship for the boys while Julian tried to get himself together. He agreed because he didn't know what else to do. The previous caregivers hadn't lasted. One left because the emotional weight was too much. Another quit after admitting she felt useless because the boys barely responded to her. A third had been competent but distant, performing tasks with precision but without warmth, something the boys needed more than schedules or routines. When Evelyn recommended a fourth caregiver, Sienna Brooks, Julian barely listened. He was in the middle of a tense call with his CFO and simply muttered, "Sure, hire her," before returning to the crisis at hand. He didn't review her application. He didn't ask where she came from or what made her different. He didn't even meet her on her first day. He was too exhausted to care, too worn down to believe that one more person could make any real difference in the wreckage his family had become. But even in his numbness, Julian noticed small changes. A new pair of rain boots for the boys by the mudroom door. Crayon drawings taped neatly on the fridge, drawings he hadn't seen them create. The faint sound of a woman's voice reading aloud from a picture book when he passed the nursery hallway. He didn't step inside. He didn't introduce himself. For weeks he simply moved around the edges of whatever was happening in his own home, too afraid to hope and too uncertain to engage. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the person he had barely acknowledged would soon become the catalyst for everything that followed. He had no idea that Sienna had walked into his home carrying grief of her own, grief that shaped the way she saw children, the way she understood pain, and the way she approached healing. He didn't know she had lost a daughter named Willow. He didn't know she had learned to rebuild her world piece by fragile piece. And he certainly didn't know that she would soon reach into the quiet places of his sons' hearts and coax out something he thought they had lost forever. Julian believed his family was trapped in an irreversible downward spiral. He had no idea that just a few rooms away the first spark of change had already begun. Something shifted inside Julian the moment he stepped through the front door that afternoon. He had expected the same heavy atmosphere he'd been walking into for months. The same weight that wrapped itself around the house the way fog clings to a shoreline. But what he heard instead was so unexpected that his body froze before his mind could make sense of it. Laughter. Not polite laughter, not the kind coaxed out of children during play dates or school performances, but the kind that bubbled up naturally, light, breathless, unrestrained. The kind that once filled this house every morning before breakfast. The kind Harper used to joke was the soundtrack of their lives. Julian hadn't heard that sound since the accident, not even faintly, not even in dreams. Yet here it was, echoing faintly from somewhere down the hallway. For a split second he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Grief had done stranger things before. It could produce memories so vivid they felt real, or spark illusions that briefly convinced him Harper's footsteps were upstairs or that the boys were jiggling in their old playroom. But this wasn't an illusion, this was real. He could hear the distinct tones of his son Caleb's higher pitch, Asher's soft staccato bursts, Finn's raspy giggle that always bordered on a hiccup. The sound was unmistakable, and it hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. His briefcase nearly slipped from his hand. His heartbeat thudded unevenly, a mix of shock and something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. Not the fragile kind that appeared right after the funeral, the kind he kept trying to rationalize. This was deeper, raw, fearful even. Because if this hope was real, if his boys were truly laughing, then it meant something had changed. Something had cracked open in the gray haze they'd been living in, and Julian didn't know whether to rush toward it or run from it. He followed the sound through the hallway, moving slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might flee if he made the wrong move. His shoes clicked softly against the polished hardwood floor, his breath felt strangely tight. Every step he took heightened the clarity of the laughter, layering warmth onto a house that had grown cold for far too long. He hesitated outside the doorway of the sunroom, Harper's favorite room, the one she had filled with plants, bright cushions, and sunlight that spilled through the glass walls like honey. Even after she passed, the room maintained an echo of her energy, and Julian rarely entered it because being surrounded by her touch felt both comforting and punishing. He placed a hand on the doorframe and inhaled sharply before stepping inside, and that was when he saw it. The scene was so unexpected, so wildly out of place in the life he'd come to know, that his breath caught in his throat. Sienna Brooks, the caregiver he had barely spoken to since she arrived, was on her hands and knees in the middle of the sunroom rug. Caleb, Asher, and Finn were perched on her back as though she were a horse, their cheeks flushed from laughing so hard. Sienna tossed her head and made an exaggerated clopping sound, bouncing gently to keep them balanced. Her curly hair fell forward across her shoulders, catching the afternoon light. She looked nothing like the worn-out caregivers before her. She looked alive, engaged, fearless. Julian blinked, unsure whether to trust what he was seeing. His sons weren't tense. They weren't guarded or withdrawn. They weren't clutching each other the way they usually did. They were leaning forward, grabbing handfuls of Sienna's shirt to stay steady, shrieking joyfully as she pretended to gallop around the rug. Their eyes were bright. Their smiles were wide enough to hurt his heart. These were the children they used to be before the hospital, before the funeral, before they started asking where Harper went and why she couldn't come home. For a long moment, Julian simply watched, his hands still gripping the frame as though he needed something to steady himself. He couldn't remember the last time he felt this stunned. Relief washed over him, first warm, overwhelming, almost dizzying. Then shame crept up behind it, sharp and pointed. Shame that someone else had reached his sons in ways he hadn't. Shame that he hadn't been the one to spark their joy. Shame that while he had been drowning in meetings and grief and responsibilities, it was Sienna, quiet, unassuming, practically a stranger who had somehow opened a door back into the world for them. As he stood there absorbing the scene, Sienna turned her head slightly and caught sight of him. Her expression shifted instantly. The latter around her faded as the boys followed her gaze. She froze uncertain, her hands still on the rug. The triplets slid off her back and moved closer to her, almost protectively. Finn grabbed the back of her shirt. Caleb stepped in front of her slightly. Asher pressed his shoulder into her side. Julian's heart clenched. They weren't just playing with her, they were seeking comfort in her presence. He knew he should say something, but the words jammed in his throat. His emotions churned too violently for him to assemble a coherent response. Sienna bit her lip, unsure whether she had overstepped. The boys looked at Julian with wide eyes, waiting for approval or disapproval, or something that would tell them whether this happiness they'd somehow rediscovered was allowed to exist. Julian forced himself to swallow the tightness in his throat. He nodded once, small, barely visible, but enough. Sienna's shoulders loosened. The boys exhaled softly, then Julian stepped back before anyone could see the tears threatening to rise. He wasn't ready to show that part of himself, not yet, not when he didn't fully understand the storm stirring inside him. He walked down the hallway with uneven steps, bracing a hand against the wall as if his body needed support to process what he'd just witnessed. Laughter, real laughter, it played in his mind like a melody he had forgotten existed. He didn't know how Sienna had done it, but she had awakened something no one else had managed to awaken, not therapists, not specialists, not even him. And that realization cut deeper than he expected, because beneath the relief was another feeling he didn't want to acknowledge, a jealousy. A strange, painful jealousy of her ability to reach the pieces of his children he feared were lost forever. But more than jealousy, there was gratitude, heavy, staggering gratitude. If he had stayed a minute longer in that sunroom, he might have thanked her right then. He might have broken down in front of her. Instead, he retreated to collect himself, to make sense of the first glimmer of hope he'd felt in nearly a year. Sienna Brooks had been in his house for less than a month, yet she had managed to accomplish something extraordinary. And as Julian leaned against the cool marble wall of the foyer, one truth settled into him with undeniable clarity. Whatever she had brought into his home, warmth, connection, healing, was only just beginning. That night, after witnessing the unexpected burst of joy in the sunroom, Julian found himself unable to focus on anything except what he had seen. He retreated into his office as he usually did, but the familiar weight he expected to settle in his chest never came. Instead, his mind replayed the image of his sons with an almost intrusive persistence of Caleb's arms flung around Sienna's shoulders, Asher's face flushed with laughter, Finn trying to hold on while nearly falling off her back. It was as if someone had taken a faded photograph and restored it to full color. The problem was that Julian didn't know how to process it. He didn't know whether to feel joy, grief, or guilt, so all three emotions tangled together into something sharp and restless that kept him pacing across the room long after the sun had gone down. The office had become his nighttime refuge over the past year, partly because it was the only room that didn't reflect Harper's presence so strongly. It had always been his domain: glass desk, polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with files and prototypes. Even so, the space felt foreign tonight. He walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling backyard bathed in moonlight, feeling the unfamiliar stir of something he hadn't felt in months. Possibility, the sense that maybe the story of his family wasn't fixed in its broken shape. Maybe something new was forming, subtle but undeniably real. Julian lowered himself onto the couch, elbows braced on his knees, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. He tried to slow his breathing, but the rush of thoughts refused to quiet down. He remembered when Harper used to kneel in the living room with the boys climbing all over her while he stood by watching, convinced their future was invincible. She always said he underestimated how deeply children needed connection, the kind that didn't come from structure or routines, but from simple presence. Julian had always been the planner, the strategist, the builder. Harper had been the warmth, the heart. And when she was gone, he'd tried to fill both roles, not realizing that grief doesn't respond to logic no matter how many schedules you create. But Sienna, somehow she understood something he didn't. Something he hadn't even recognized was missing until he saw it in front of him. She brought a softness into the house without forcing it, without performing or pushing. He could see it in the way she moved around the boys, not afraid to get messy or look ridiculous. And they responded to her because she didn't ask them to be anything other than what they were, 3 children trying to find their footing again after their world had been shattered. Julian leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. He wondered how long she had been doing this. Playing with them, talking to them, drawing out the pieces of their personalities he thought grief had buried. How many moments had he missed while drowning in work? Telling himself he was being responsible when the truth was he didn't know how to face his own children without feeling like he was failing them. It wasn't that he didn't love them enough. It was that he loved them so much it terrified him. And seeing Sienna succeed where he couldn't left a complicated ache in his chest, part gratitude, part jealousy, part relief that someone had finally stepped in where he hadn't known how. Yet something about her didn't fit the pattern of the previous caregivers. She didn't walk on eggshells. She didn't treat the boys as fragile artifacts. She treated them like children whose joy had been paused, not erased. He wondered if she knew grief on a deeper level, the kind that stripped you down until only instinct remained. He hadn't allowed himself to look closely at her since she arrived. His interactions with her had been polite, distant, the bare minimum required of an employer who was barely keeping himself upright. But after today, he couldn't ignore her presence anymore, not when the evidence of her impact filled the hallways. Julian exhaled slowly, his mind traveling back to the sound of the boys' laughter. It had carried a strange combination of familiarity and shock, almost like hearing a favorite song you'd forgotten existed. He had tried so hard to recreate moments like that. He'd taken them to parks, built blanket forts, bought new toys, booked sessions with specialists. But the laughter they had shared with Sienna was different. It was effortless, natural. It wasn't something he could manufacture with money or planning. As the hours slipped by, Julian realized he wasn't going to sleep, not tonight. He pushed himself up from the couch and wandered the house the way he often did when rest felt impossible. He walked through the kitchen where the faint scent of the boys' dinner still lingered. He walked past the art wall where Harper used to hang their finger paintings. He walked down the same hallway where he had first heard the boys' laughter earlier that day, the memory fresh enough to warm him and cut him at the same time. He paused at the entrance of the sunroom but didn't step inside. The toys scattered across the floor told the story of an afternoon he had missed. The throw pillows were still in disarray from Sienna's horse ride. The room felt lighter than it had in a long time, as though something had been breathed back into it. Julian stood there for a long moment, absorbing the afterglow of the day he hadn't expected, feeling Harper's presence in the room in a way that wasn't painful for once. She would have loved Sienna, he thought. Loved her spirit, her warmth, her patience. She would have known instantly what Julian had been too lost to see, that Sienna was exactly the kind of person the boys needed. The kind of person he needed, even if he wasn't ready to admit that out loud. Reluctantly, he turned away and continued wandering. The boys' bedroom doors were closed, but he stepped closer until he could hear their soft breaths. He imagined them sleeping differently tonight, lighter. Maybe after an afternoon filled with the kind of joy their little bodies had been starved for. He rested his palm on the wooden frame, letting himself feel something he had tried to bury for too long: pride. Not in himself but in them, for surviving, for bending without breaking. By the time he returned to his office, dawn was creeping up behind the trees outside. He sat at his desk watching the light shift across the yard, and wondered how one afternoon could change the shape of everything he had come to expect. Maybe healing didn't arrive with therapy sessions or structured plans. Maybe it arrived in smaller ways: a moment of laughter. Connection formed quietly between children and someone brave enough to meet them where they were. Julian didn't know what the next day would look like, or the next month, or the next year. But for the first time since Harper's death, he felt something stir inside him that wasn't dread. Something that whispered that maybe this wasn't the end of their story. Maybe it was the beginning of a different one he never saw coming, but one he desperately needed. And as the sunlight brightened the edges of the room, Julian found himself repeating a truth he had nearly forgotten. Sometimes, the smallest moments are the ones that change everything. The next morning, Julian woke earlier than usual, long before the house began to stir. He told himself it was because he had a call with Tokyo scheduled at 7. But the truth sat quietly beneath the excuse. He wanted to see what the boys would look like today. He wanted to know whether yesterday had been a fluke or the first step towards something brighter. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he found himself standing at the top of the staircase, listening, almost afraid of what he might or might not hear. The house felt different in the early light, as though the air itself held a faint echo of the laughter he'd heard the day before. Julian wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but the memory alone was enough to push him down the stairs. He entered the kitchen and froze at the sight of Sienna Brooks at the stove, already dressed, already moving with the same calm confidence he had witnessed the day before. She hadn't heard him come in. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she hummed under her breath as she cracked eggs into a pan. She moved with an ease that made the room feel warmer, more grounded. The kitchen had not felt like this since Harper used to fill it with her presence on weekend mornings, flipping pancakes while orchestrating conversations and snacks and lost shoes all at once. Seeing Sienna there stirred something unexpected in him, an ache and a tenderness he didn't have a name for. Julian stood in the doorway longer than he should have, watching her work, unsure how to step into the moment without disrupting it. He wasn't used to wanting to be part of anything. For months, he had drifted through the house like a visitor, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. Yet now there was a pull he couldn't ignore. Something had shifted, and he wanted to understand it. Before he could speak, the rapid footsteps of little feet thundered down the hallway. Caleb and Asher burst into the kitchen first, still wearing their pajamas, hair sticking in every direction. Finn followed close behind, clutching a toy truck in one hand. They didn't notice Julian at first. Their eyes went straight to Sienna, as if she were the center of their morning. Caleb tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Sienna, can we play the horse game again today?" he asked with a spark that startled Julian.
Asher chimed in, "Or maybe the astronaut one."
"The one you said we could try." Finn just leaned into her hip as if anchoring himself there, comfortable and unafraid. The sight of it squeezed Julian's chest unexpectedly, not in a painful way, but in a way that reminded him of something precious he thought he had lost for good. Sienna finally glanced up and saw Julian standing there. Her smile faltered just a hint, uncertainty flickering across her eyes, as though she wasn't sure how much of yesterday he had witnessed, or whether she had crossed an invisible line. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she said softly. Julian opened his mouth, but the formality struck him like a jolt. "Julian," he corrected gently. "Just Julian is fine." His voice sounded rough, unused to speaking so early, or maybe unused to speaking with someone who wasn't tied to business or tragedy. Sienna nodded politely and returned her attention to the sizzling pan, but the tension beneath her calm was subtle and unmistakable. He hated that she felt unsure around him, especially after what she had done for his sons. The boys finally noticed him and turned, 3 sets of blue eyes widening. They looked at him differently this morning, still cautious, still aware of his fragility, but not distant. A spark of something like trust flickered briefly, and Julian felt a strange mix of humility and fear rush through him. During breakfast, he lingered near the end of the table with a cup of coffee, pretending to scan his emails while stealing glances at the interaction unfolding between Sienna and the boys. They leaned toward her naturally. They talked to her in short bursts, not full conversations yet, but more than he'd heard from them in months. Finn told her about a dream involving a talking truck. Caleb asked whether dinosaurs could come back one day. Asher quietly pushed a blueberry muffin toward Sienna as though offering a peace treaty. She accepted it with a soft laugh and thanked him as if it were the most meaningful gift in the world. Julian found himself studying her reaction to them, the way she listened closely, the way she responded without talking down to them or tiptoeing around their grief. She possessed a steady presence he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't forced, it wasn't rehearsed, it was simply who she was. The boys felt safe around her in a way they hadn't felt safe with anyone else, not even with him. The realization stung at first, but then something gentler replaced the sting: gratitude. Because however she had managed to reach them, it was working. For the first time in nearly a year, they looked like children again. After breakfast, Caleb asked again, "Can we play horse after we get dressed?" He looked nervously between Sienna and Julian, as though the question needed 2 permissions. Sienna hesitated, her gaze flicking toward Julian with quiet caution. Julian realized then how much his response mattered, not just to his sons, but to her. After breakfast he heard himself say, surprising both her and the boys, Three little heads snapped in his direction, eyes wide with something close to amazement. "Really?" Finn whispered. "Really," Julian said, forcing a small smile. That smile felt foreign, like a muscle he had forgotten how to use. Sienna looked at him, her expression softening into something warm and grateful. She nodded gently and turned back to the boys. The rest of breakfast passed in a blur of chatter and crumbs and small moments that felt strangely monumental to Julian. Moments that reminded him of life before loss. Moments that hinted at a life after it. When the boys ran upstairs to get dressed, their footsteps energetic instead of heavy, Julian found himself alone with Sienna for the first time. She wiped the counter with careful, methodical motions, clearly unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. He stepped closer, not wanting the air between them to carry the weight of uncertainty. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but firm. She froze for a moment, cloth in hand. "You don't need to thank me," she replied softly. "It's my job." Julian shook his head. "No. What you did yesterday and this morning, it's more than a job." She looked at him, then really looked at him, and Julian felt something shift between them. Something delicate but unmistakable. "They're incredible kids," she said quietly. "They just needed room to breathe again." He swallowed, unsure how to respond. He wasn't ready to talk about the parts of himself that had made it hard for them to breathe in the first place. But as she turned back to rinse the pan, Julian knew one thing with absolute clarity. Sienna Brooks was not just another caregiver. She was the reason his home felt different. And he wasn't sure what scared him more, acknowledging it or wanting more of it. Julian hadn't intended to start coming home earlier. It wasn't a conscious decision or a moment of resolve. It just happened gradually, almost quietly, as though his body made the decision before his mind caught up. At first he told himself it was just coincidence, meetings ending early, traffic lighter than expected, schedules shifting in ways that left him free to drive back to Greenwich before the sun set. But deep down he knew the truth. He wasn't racing home to rest or to decompress or even to escape work. He was racing home because he wanted to know what his boys looked like when they were with Sienna. It wasn't jealousy anymore, not even close. It was curiosity mixed with gratitude, mixed with something far more fragile, a longing. Not longing for Sienna specifically, not yet, but longing to be part of whatever magic she seemed to carry into the house each day. His sons gravitated toward her like flowers bending toward sunlight, and Julian realized he hadn't seen them seek anyone like that since Harper. The pull wasn't just emotional, it was visible in the way they moved, the way their voices lifted when she entered a room, the way they shifted their small bodies toward her instinctively, trusting she would respond with warmth. One Tuesday afternoon, Julian walked into the house earlier than usual and heard soft voices drifting from the backyard. He stepped toward the patio, drawn by the sound, and found the triplets sitting on a blanket spread across the grass. Sienna was beside them with a stack of picture books and a small box of wooden blocks, making shapes with them while the boys guessed what she was building. Caleb guessed a castle, Asher guessed a rocket ship, Fen guessed a dinosaur, even though it looked nothing like one. Sienna laughed, not correcting him, simply rearranging the blocks so it did look a little like a dinosaur. Julian stayed at the edge of the window, watching without interrupting. There was a softness in her posture, a patient, grounded energy that made the boys feel safe enough to speak again. They weren't talking constantly, but the small bursts of conversation felt monumental. Finn leaned against her arm. Caleb rested his hand on her knee as comfortably as if he'd known her for years. Asher scooted closer whenever she spoke. These subtle gestures told a story that words couldn't. They trusted her. They felt anchored by her presence in a way they didn't feel around anyone else. Sienna never exaggerated her reactions, never used a sing-sing voice or tried too hard to entertain them. She didn't treat them like they were fragile or broken. She spoke to them as if they were capable, important, worth listening to. And it worked. Julian had spent months trying to solve their grief as if it were a problem with a defined solution. Sienna didn't solve anything. She simply gave them room to exist without pressure. Maybe that was what they had needed all along. As the weeks passed, Julian noticed more changes. The boys became more expressive in small ways, Caleb drawing pictures and leaving them on the kitchen counter, Asher humming while getting dressed, Finn beginning to narrate his playtime again. None of it was loud or dramatic, but every shift felt like a miracle to Julian. Healing wasn't loud. It was gradual and unpredictable, showing itself in tiny moments that could easily be overlooked if he wasn't paying attention. But for the first time in a long while, he was paying attention. Some evenings, he found the boys curled up beside Sienna while she read to them. Other times he'd find her sitting cross-legged on the floor building elaborate block towers while the boys crashed toy cars into them. Sometimes she just sat with them quietly, brushing Finn's hair back or rubbing calming circles on Caleb's back. She wasn't filling the air with noise or distraction, she was filling the space with presence. And presence, Julian realized, was something he hadn't been able to offer consistently since the day Harper died. He began watching from the upstairs hallway or from the doorway of a room, careful not to disturb the peace she created. There was something comforting in observing from afar, like being allowed to witness a fragile transformation without risking breaking it. But one evening, as he stood in the doorway longer than usual, Sienna glanced up and caught him watching. He expected her to look embarrassed or startled, but she simply offered a small, gentle smile before turning back to the boys. The gesture was so simple yet so disarming that Julian found himself rooted to the spot, warmed by the quiet acknowledgement that she saw him not just the employer, but the father who desperately wanted to help his children heal. Yet despite her outward calm, he sometimes saw flickers of something deeper in her expression when she thought no one was looking, a heaviness, a sadness she kept tucked beneath her steady demeanor. He noticed it in the curve of her shoulders at the end of long days, in the way her gaze drifted when the boys spoke about their mother, in the way she held a small silver locket she always wore around her neck. He didn't know the story behind her sorrow, but he sensed it was real and that it was the reason she understood grief so intuitively. Julian wanted to ask her about it. More than once he found himself opening his mouth to start a conversation, only to stop himself. He didn't know if it was his place. He didn't know if asking would break the quiet balance they had somehow built in such a short time. Still, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, not romantic, not yet, but something undeniably human. A pull toward someone who knew how to sit with brokenness without turning away. Even the staff noticed the change in the boys. Margaret, his mother-in-law, commented one afternoon that the house felt lighter these days. The gardener mentioned that Finn waved to him again. The housekeeper said Caleb asked her how her day was going, a question he hadn't asked anyone in nearly a year. Julian listened, humbled. He knew the change wasn't because of him. It was because of Sienna. But the quietest realization, the one that hit him hardest, was this: he didn't dread coming home anymore. He wasn't dragging himself through the door with the weight of grief strapped across his shoulders. He wanted to be there. He wanted to see the boys. He wanted to see Sienna. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about connection. It was about hope. One evening, as he watched Sienna help the boys prepare for bed, he caught himself wondering what she was like outside the walls of his home. What she laughed at, what she dreamed about, what her life had been before she stepped into his. The thought came unexpectedly, subtle but undeniable. And for the first time since losing Harper, Julian felt a stirring inside him that didn't come from grief but from life, real, living emotion awakening slowly, cautiously, like something testing the air after a long winter. He didn't know where any of this was going. He didn't know what it meant for him, or for Sienna, or for the fragile balance of the household. But he knew this much with certainty. She had brought his sons back to him, and in doing so she had begun bringing him back to himself. Night came softly over the Hayes estate, stretching long shadows across the hallways as the boys settled into sleep. Julian had spent the evening drifting from room to room the way he often did, checking on the triplets twice, pretending it was for their sake when truthfully it was for his own. Each time he peeked in, he felt a small, quiet relief wash through him at the sight of their peaceful breathing. And each time he thought of Sienna, how she had made nights like this possible again. But what Julian didn't expect that night was to find her awake when everyone else in the house had already retreated. He'd wandered further than usual, pacing through the downstairs rooms in hopes of clearing the agitation that had been tugging at him all day. It wasn't anxiety, not exactly. It was something else. Something that sat behind his ribs and refused to let him rest. He had nearly returned to his office when he saw it, the soft glow coming from the library. He paused at the doorway. The library had always been Harper's sanctuary, filled with her favorite books and the deep leather couch she used to nap on while the boys played on the rug. Julian rarely entered this room anymore. It held too many memories he wasn't strong enough to face. But tonight it held something else entirely. Sienna. She sat curled in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled up, a book open in her lap. Her shoes were off, her toes tucked beneath her, and she looked at peace in a way Julian hadn't seen before, not the calm she wore around the boys, but something more vulnerable, more personal. The lamplight cast warm gold across her face, highlighting the soft curls that framed her features. She didn't see him right away, and for a moment Julian simply watched her. There was something striking about the stillness she carried, not emptiness, not detachment, but quiet strength, the kind built through loss and endurance. When he cleared his throat gently, she looked up. She didn't startle, didn't scramble to sit straighter, or pretend she hadn't been lost in her own world. She just watched him with those deep, steady eyes that seemed to understand far more than he ever said. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "No," Julian admitted, stepping into the room, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. "Not really." Sienna nodded as if she already expected that answer. She closed her book but kept a thumb tucked inside to hold her page. "Heavy thoughts?" she asked. Julian let out a short breath, something like that. She smiled faintly, not pitying, just acknowledging. She shifted slightly, giving him space on the opposite end of the couch, though neither of them said anything about it. He sat down, careful to leave a respectful distance, but even so, the air felt different in this room with her in it. Not lighter exactly, but warmer, more bearable. "What are you reading?" he asked, noticing the worn spine. "Beloved," she said, lifting the book slightly, Toni Morrison. Julian raised a brow. "Heavy reading for this hour." Sienna gave a small laugh. "Heavy thoughts need heavy books." She said it casually, but there was an undertone there, a quiet truth she'd learned the hard way. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the pause didn't feel uncomfortable, it felt natural. Like two people sitting in the aftermath of the same storm, breathing through the remnants together. Julian felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time all day, simply from sharing a room with someone who wasn't expecting anything from him. He found himself speaking before he knew the words were coming. "They laughed yesterday." Sienna turned fully toward him, expression softening. "Yeah," she said gently, "they did. I haven't heard that sound since." He stopped, throat tightening around the rest. "Since Harper." He didn't say it out loud, but the truth hung between them anyway. "They talk about her," Sienna said softly, as though the words needed to be handled with care. Julian's head snapped toward her. "They do." She nodded. "They tell me stories sometimes, little ones." Her voice lowered, gentler still. "They remember her laugh, her smell. How she used to sing off key in the car. How she made pancakes in shapes that didn't look like shapes." Julian blinked hard, emotion rising too quickly. He hadn't heard those memories in months. The boys never spoke of Harper around him. He thought maybe they had pushed her away because he couldn't bear hearing her name. The realization hit him like a blow. They weren't afraid to remember her, they were afraid to hurt him. He swallowed. "I didn't know they remembered those things." "They remember everything," Sienna said. "Kids don't lose love just because they lose the person who held it." Julian let out a shaky exhale, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I don't know how to thank you for what you're redoing. For what you've already done." Sienna shook her head, eyes glistening. "You don't have to thank me, Julian. I know what it feels like. To lose someone who felt like your whole world." He looked at her, then really looked. And in the soft glow of the lamp, he saw a depth in her expression he hadn't noticed before. Something wounded, something familiar. "Is that why you're here?" he asked quietly. "Because you understand." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her book. "Partly," she whispered. "And partly because this is the kind of family I would be wanted once." There it was, that flicker of pain he kept sensing around her edges. A story she hadn't shared yet. A story he wasn't ready to pry open, but one he felt connected to all the same. For a long moment, they sat there, two people bound not by circumstance but by the shape of their grief. Yet for once, the weight didn't feel suffocating, it felt shared. "Good night," Sienna finally whispered, rising gently from the couch. But before she walked out, before the warmth she carried could leave the room, Julian managed to speak. "I slept better tonight," he said quietly, surprising even himself. Not because the thoughts were lighter, but because they weren't mine alone. Sienna paused in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the dim hallway light. She didn't turn around fully, but her voice softened into something that touched him deeper than he expected. "Then I'm glad I stayed up," she whispered. And then she was gone. Julian sat there long after she left, staring at the empty space where she had been. The room didn't feel as haunted tonight. The memories didn't sting as sharply. Something had shifted between them, something fragile, something he didn't yet understand, but for the first time in a year, Julian felt the faintest spark of connection forming beyond the boundaries of grief. And as he leaned back into the seat Harper once loved so much, Julian realized a truth that made his breath catch. He wasn't just watching his sons heal. He was beginning to heal too, and Sienna Brooks was the reason. 3 weeks passed, and with each passing day, Julian found himself slipping further away from the rigid routine he had clung to since Harper's death. He wasn't aware of the exact moment things shifted. It wasn't a conscious decision or a deliberate act of rebuilding. It was slower, gentler, like thawing after a long freeze. Something inside him simply softened, and his evenings began drifting toward home rather than toward work. His assistant noticed, his board noticed, but no one questioned him, because even through video conferences and tense meetings, people could see something had changed, even if they didn't understand what it was. For Julian, the answer was simple. His house didn't feel like a burden anymore. He hadn't realized how heavy it had felt to walk through his own front door until that weight began to lift. Now, instead of stepping into a space that echoed his grief, he stepped into a home filled with signs of life again. Toys left out rather than packed away, half-finished drawings taped near the fridge. Bright socks abandoned near the couch because one of the boys had decided socks were too itchy halfway through the day. Each small mess used to feel like a reminder of what he had lost. Now it felt like a reminder of what was coming back. The biggest change, however, was Sienna. Julian didn't admit that part out loud even to himself, but he felt it every day. The pull toward the part of the house where her voice drifted through hallways, toward the sound of her reading, toward the laughter she coaxed from his sons with ease he still couldn't explain. Whenever he came home, he found himself searching for the faint trail of her presence before anything else. Some days it led him to the backyard, where Sienna sat cross-legged on the grass, playing imaginative games that looked far too exhausting for an adult yet came naturally to her. She never sat above the boys. She sat with them on the ground, in the dirt, letting them climb her, letting them tug on her hair, letting them lead the way even when the path made no sense. Caleb might suddenly invent a game about dragons. Asher might decide everything needed to be built into space stations. Finn might run in circles until he collapsed on the blanket giggling, and Sienna matched their energy every time, laughing with them, encouraging them without forcing anything. Julian often watched unseen from the upstairs window, trying to understand how she did it, how she stepped into their world so easily. But the truth was simple: she wasn't performing, she was present. Fully, genuinely present in a way Julian had forgotten how to be. Other evenings he found them in the playroom, surrounded by building blocks and crayons, the boys leaning against her legs as she read aloud with animated voices. She changed her tone for each character, even for the smallest illustrations in the background. Finn always giggled the hardest at those. Asher listened with the kind of concentration Julian usually only saw during doctor visits. Caleb asked questions every few lines, always curious, always hungry for details. It was in these moments that Julian felt something unfamiliar rise inside him. Pride not for himself, but for them. For the way they were transforming. For the way their shoulders rested naturally now, no longer hunched with an emotion they didn't understand. For the way they were rediscovering pieces of themselves he feared were lost forever. But along with pride, there was something else stirring in him. Something he didn't know how to name yet. Something that appeared whenever Sienna glanced up and offered him a gentle smile. Whenever she brushed one of the boys' curls behind their ear as though it were instinct. Whenever she looked at the children the way Harper once had, with devotion, with empathy, with everything in her heart. Sienna's presence didn't erase Harper's memory, it didn't fill the void Harper left behind. But it created a bridge Julian didn't know he needed, a bridge that allowed him to walk through grief instead of being swallowed by it. Still beneath the warmth Sienna brought into the house, Julian noticed something else. A shadow she carried quietly. A heaviness that peeked through whenever she thought no one was watching. She worked with joy, but sometimes her eyes fell to her locket, the silver one she wore every day, and Julian saw something in her expression, a kind of longing, a wound that ran deep. He didn't know her story yet, but he sensed it was written in those moments when her breaths came slower, gentler, as if holding something fragile inside. He wanted to ask, he stopped himself every time. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much already. One evening Julian returned home earlier than expected. He found the boys sprawled across the living room rug, coloring in a massive roll of white butcher paper that Sienna had taped to the floor. She sat among them, helping Asher draw what looked like a very friendly-looking dinosaur, while Caleb argued passionately that dinosaurs should not be smiling. Finn, naturally, was drawing trucks in the background of everyone else's drawings. Julian leaned against the doorway and watched unnoticed. A warmth settled over him as he observed the natural rhythm they had formed together, the soft conversations, the gentle corrections, the way Sienna guided without controlling. The boys didn't cling to her out of fear, they gravitated toward her out of comfort. As he watched, an unexpected realization washed through him: he could breathe in this room. He wasn't fighting memories or bracing for emotional impact. He wasn't shrinking under the weight of what used to be. For the first time since Harper's death, Julian was simply existing in a space with his children, and it felt natural. It felt good. But then Sienna looked up. Her eyes met his across the room, and something shifted. She didn't startle. She didn't stiffen. She simply smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes and warmed something deep inside him. It wasn't flirtatious or hesitant. It was recognition. Acknowledgement of someone who had been watching this transformation as closely as she had. Someone who cared just as deeply. And in that single look, Julian realized something he hadn't expected so soon. She wasn't just healing his sons. She was healing him. He stepped inside the room, and the boys immediately rushed him. Caleb held up a drawing of a dinosaur holding a flashlight. Asher pointed out the planet he had drawn for the dinosaur to stand on. Finn tugged on Julian's hand and proudly showed him a truck he had drawn with what appeared to be 20 wheels. Julian laughed, a sound rare enough that the boys looked delighted by it. Sienna watched him, her expression softening in a way that made Julian's heart stutter. She wasn't watching him as an employer. She wasn't watching him as someone evaluating his parenting. She was simply watching a father rediscover a connection he thought he'd lost, and she looked proud. Later that night, after the boys were in bed and the house grew quieter, Julian found himself wandering again. But this time, he didn't wander because he felt lost. He wandered because he couldn't stop thinking about how today had felt. How natural it had been to join them on the floor. How easy it had been to laugh. How right it had felt to walk into a room where Sienna existed. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking toward the guest hallway where her room was. He didn't go to her door. He didn't need to. Just standing there, he understood something clearly. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. And though he would never admit it aloud, not yet, the reason was simple. Sienna Brooks had brought more than laughter back into his home. She had brought hope. The evening of the gala arrived with a crisp chill in the Connecticut air. The kind that usually signaled the beginning of the season, when Greenwich's wealthiest residents appeared in their best gowns and tailored suits. Julian Hayes had never been fond of events like these, even before Harper passed, but after losing her, they felt like foreign territory, rooms filled with people who once shared dinners and vacations with him, now unsure how to act around a widower who had spent months withdrawing from their world. For a long time, Julian avoided every invitation placed on his desk or forwarded by his assistant. He didn't have the energy for conversations that tiptoed around grief, or for polite questions about how he and the boys were adjusting. But when Evelyn, his mother-in-law, insisted he attend this charity gala at the Greenwich Country Club, he reluctantly agreed, knowing she meant well even if the thought of going made his stomach tighten. From the moment he walked into the ballroom, with its chandeliers glittering like frost and its tables draped in expensive linens, Julian felt eyes on him, not in a malicious way, but in the way people watched a story they had gossiped about for months suddenly unfold in real time. He could read their expressions easily: sympathy, curiosity, discomfort, and something sharper beneath it all: judgment. Some wondered if he had returned too soon. Others wondered why he had stayed away so long. And some, he realized with a sinking feeling, were watching to see whether the rumors about him and the new caregiver had any truth behind them. He ignored the stares as best he could, moving through the crowd with a practiced nod, answering obligatory greetings. A few old colleagues approached him with questions about Hayes dynamics, stock projections, and new product rumors, but Julian barely heard them. His mind was back home with the boys, with Sienna. He wished he hadn't left them tonight. He wished he didn't have to endure this performance. But then Harrison Blake appeared, a fellow tech CEO, someone Julian had known for years, usually accompanied by his impeccably dressed wife, Vanessa. Tonight was no exception. Harrison greeted him warmly enough, but Vanessa's smile carried an unmistakable sharpness, the kind of polished sweetness that hid something sour beneath. "Julian," she said, brushing a kiss against the air near his cheek, "it's so good to see you out again. We've all been so worried about you." He forced a polite smile. "Thank you, I appreciate that." Vanessa leaned in a little closer, her voice lilting with friendliness but edged with something else. "And how are the boys? I heard they've had quite a lot of adjustment lately." Julian didn't like the way she said adjustment. "They were doing better," he answered calmly. "Much better, actually." "Oh yes," Vanessa replied, exchanging a glance with her husband. "We heard you found someone new to help with them. What was her name again?" Selena. Sienna, Julian corrected, jaw tightening. Right, Vanessa said, her eyebrows lifting. "Well, people are saying wonderful things about her. It's remarkable how involved she seems to be." The way she said involved made Julian's stomach twist. Harrison cleared his throat beside her, trying to steer the conversation, but Vanessa wasn't done. "I think it's lovely, truly," she continued, swirling the champagne in her glass. "Though some people might say she's unusually close for household staff." The words hit Julian like ice against his skin. He straightened, the warmth in his expression gone. "I'm not sure what you were implying," he said evenly. Vanessa placed a manicured hand lightly on his arm. "Nothing at all, darling, it's just that people talk. There was a photo online last week, you and the boys at the farmer's market. Sienna holding hands with one of them, you pushing the cart. It all looked very cozy." "We were buying groceries," Julian said, irritation threading through his tone. "Of course," Vanessa said, her eyes glittering. "But you know how people interpret things. A young woman, a widower, 3 boys, it makes for quite a story." Julian didn't raise his voice, but something in his expression shifted. The only story that matters is that my children are finally laughing again. Harrison stepped forward, hands lifted in a placating gesture. Julian, I'm sure she didn't mean. I did mean it, Vanessa interrupted gently, her tone dipped in false innocence. I just think it's wise to consider how it looks. For the boy's sake, you understand. But Julian didn't understand, not in the way she meant. He saw the message beneath her words. Sienna didn't fit. Not into their society, not into their expectations, not into the narrow mold they believed defined an acceptable family. She was too young, too warm, too present, too black. And that combination made people uncomfortable. Julian left the conversation without another word. He moved through the ballroom in a haze, no longer hearing the music or the chatter or the clinking glasses. Vanessa's insinuations followed him like an unwelcome echo. He had expected whispers, they were inevitable in communities like this, but he hadn't expected them to feel so sharp, so personal, so deeply unfair. He barely stayed another 20 minutes before slipping out. The cold air outside the club bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it. It felt cleaner than the atmosphere he'd just escaped. As he drove home, headlights cutting through the dark Connecticut roads, Julian's thoughts churned. He replayed Vanessa's tone, her looks, the way she shaped her words like she was discussing a scandal rather than observing a grieving family trying to heal. He felt anger, yes, but something heavier too, fear. Fear of how these whispers might reach Sienna. Fear of how they might affect the boys. Fear that the first fragile steps toward healing could be derailed by people who understood nothing about loss, but pretended they did. That fear became reality sooner than he anticipated. The next morning, as he sifted through messages at his desk, an email caught his attention from Ridgeview Preparatory School. The subject line alone made his stomach clench. When he opened it, the words hit him like a blow. Given recent public attention regarding your household, and considering concerns raised by several families, we believe it may be best to postpone the boys' enrollment until the following semester. His fingers tightened around the phone. He called them immediately, his voice sharp. The headmaster sounded apologetic but firm. The same phrases repeated: sensitive circumstances, unwanted attention, potential disruptions. Every word made Julian's anger build. You were punishing my children, he said, voice low and controlled, because they are being cared for by someone who loves them. We were doing what's best for the school community, the headmaster replied. Julian hung up before he said something he couldn't take back. He sat in his chair, unmoving, the weight of the morning pressing against him. He knew what would happen next. He knew that gossip had grown teeth, and he knew Sienna, sweet, careful, empathetic Sienna, would blame herself. He couldn't let her. He grabbed his keys, barely remembering to turn off the office lights, and drove home with a determination that bordered on desperation. He needed to reach her before she found out, before the guilt swallowed her, before she did what he feared most, leave. But when he reached the guest cottage, his heart dropped. The door was open, and Sienna was packing. Clothes folded, drawers emptied, suitcase half filled, her movements steady but her hands trembling. Her shoulders tense with a kind of heartbreak Julian recognized instantly because it looked too much like his own. Sienna, he said, breathless, stepping into the doorway. She turned slowly, her eyes already glassy with tears she hadn't let fall. I can't stay, she whispered. I've become the problem. And in that moment, Julian realized the rumors weren't the real threat. Losing her was. Julian stood in the doorway of the guest cottage, frozen for a moment that felt longer than it should have. The sight of Sienna packing, methodical, resigned, heartbreak stitched into every movement, hit him harder than he'd anticipated. He had known she might react this way once the whispers grew loud enough. He had known there was a chance she would choose to leave rather than risk causing trouble for his sons. But knowing it in theory didn't prepare him for the reality of seeing her folding shirts with trembling hands, wiping tears quickly before they had the chance to fall. Sienna, he said again, softer this time, as if raising his voice might break something between them permanently. She kept packing. Not out of anger, but out of a kind of painful determination. The kind someone develops only when they've been forced to walk away from something they care about deeply. I can't stay, she repeated, her voice quiet but resolute. I've already caused problems for the boys. I won't be the reason they get shut out of opportunities. They didn't get shut out because of you, Julian said firmly. Her laugh was soft and sad, almost apologetic. Julian, please, don't do that. He stepped fully into the room. Do what? Pretend this isn't because of me. She turned to face him, finally letting the tears spill over. I saw the article, the photo, the comments. I know what people are saying. I know why the school rejected them. It's gossip, he countered. It's meaningless. It's not meaningless to the boys, she said, voice cracking. It's not meaningless when decisions are being made about their future. And it won't stop here, this is just the beginning. Julian shook his head, frustrated not with her, but with himself for not protecting her from this sooner. You were reading too far into this. No, I'm not reading enough, she said, wiping her face. Because I should have seen this coming. I should have known better. I should have kept more distance. But I didn't, and now they're repaying for it. He took a step closer. No one is blaming you. I'm blaming me, she whispered. And there it was, the truth that sat beneath everything. She wasn't leaving because it was easier. She was leaving because she believed her presence hurt more than it helped. And that belief shattered something inside Julian. Sienna, he said slowly, my sons are finally smiling again. They're replaying, they're retalking, they're rebreathing, because of you. Because you walked into this house and brought something back we hadn't felt in a year. Her eyes softened, but her resolve didn't. That doesn't mean I should stay. So you were punishing them now? Julian asked, voice rising before he could stop it. You were taking away the one person who made them feel safe again. She flinched not at his words, but at the truth in them. He exhaled, his voice lowering. You think leaving protects them, but it doesn't. It just creates a different kind of hurt. Sienna pressed her lips together, fighting back another wave of tears. Julian, I'm the maid. I'm the caregiver. That's supposed to be my place. I'm not supposed to be the person they rely on more than their own father. You were not the maid, he snapped far too quickly. You stopped being that the day my sons laughed again. Her breath caught, visibly shaken by the intensity in his voice. Then what am I, Julian, she asked, desperate, because I don't know any more. What am I supposed to be to them? What am I supposed to be to you? The question hung in the air between them, raw, dangerous, needed. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it, the words unable to form. He knew exactly what she was. He just didn't know if saying it out loud would make everything more complicated. Sienna let out a broken laugh. You can't even say it. Because you know how it sounds. That's not fair, he said. It is fair, she insisted, stepping back. I'm young, I'm black, I'm staff. People will always assume the worst. You know it. I know it. And the boys will be caught in the middle of it every time. He wanted to argue, but her words cut too close to reality. The world wasn't kind, it wasn't fair. And the people spreading rumors weren't waiting for clarifications, they were waiting for scandal. You think I care what those people think? Julian asked, a sharp edge in his tone. You should care, she said softly. Because they won't aim their arrows at you, they'll aim them at the boys. She turned back to her suitcase and reached for another stack of clothes. Julian moved forward quickly. Sienna, stop, please, just talk to me. There's nothing left to talk about, she said, her back to him. I promised myself I'd never love another child after losing Willow. And then your boys came along, and I broke that promise without even realizing it. I love them, Julian. I love them so much it scares me, and now I'm leaving before it destroys me. He felt something inside him splinter. The raw honesty in her voice pierced him. She wasn't leaving because she didn't care. She was leaving because she cared too much. He crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of her. What if you didn't have to leave? She looked up startled. What? What if I made it clear publicly, very publicly, that your place in this family isn't temporary? That you were not a servant? That you were not a mistake? That you were not some scandal waiting to happen? Her breath hitched. Julian, what truth are you planning to tell? He swallowed. That you are essential. That the boys need you. That I need you. She stared at him, disbelief and longing written across her face. That's not the same as saying. I'm not asking you to replace Harper, he interrupted gently. I could never ask that. But I'm asking you to stay because when I think about this house without you in it, I can't breathe. The confession hung there, trembling between them. Sienna covered her mouth with her hand as tears spilled over. If I stay, Julian, it can't be in the shadows. I won't pretend to be less than I am. Good, he whispered. Because I don't want you to. She shook her head slowly. Your world won't accept me. Then my world needs to change, Julian replied without hesitation. For the first time, something hopeful flickered in her eyes. Something real, something brave. She stepped closer just an inch, but enough to close the emotional distance between them. I'll stay, she whispered at last, voice trembling. But not as the help, I'll stay as myself, all of myself. Julian felt his breath finally release. I wouldn't want it any other way. And as Sienna slowly unpacked the clothes she had folded with shaking hands, Julian realized he had crossed a point of no return. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't want a life without her in it. And the boys, those three small, resilient hearts, they didn't just need her. They loved her. And Julian Hayes wasn't going to lose her too. Julian Hayes had always been a man who understood the stakes of public perception. Running a multi-billion-dollar corporation meant living under a microscope, with every decision analyzed and every action weighed against shareholder expectations. But even with that level of scrutiny, Julian had never cared less about public approval than he did now. After Sienna unpacked her suitcase and agreed to stay not as an employee, but as a human being who mattered, Julian felt something shift inside him. A certainty, a resolve. He realized there was no version of this new life where he allowed strangers, critics, or social circles to define the shape of his family. If people were going to talk, then he would give them something worth talking about, and make sure the truth came directly from him, not through rumors warped by malice. That opportunity came sooner than he expected. A scheduled interview with the Wall Street Journal had been on his calendar for weeks, originally intended to discuss Hayes Dynamics' newest infrastructure expansion. His PRAD team had spent days crafting a neat list of talking points: growth projections, regulatory shifts, technological opportunities, the typical script. But the moment the reporter, Diana Chen, stepped into his office with her recorder and notebook, Julian understood that he couldn't hide behind spreadsheets and forecasts anymore. Not when everything in his personal life was being twisted into something ugly by people who had no right to shape the narrative. He answered her initial questions mechanically, going through the motions while his PRAD director hovered near the door like a warning sign. But then Diana paused, slid her glasses higher on her nose, and said carefully, Hayes, if you're comfortable, I'd like to address some public speculation regarding your personal life." His PRAD director's eyes widened in alarm. Julian barely glanced at him. "What specifically?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. Diana hesitated for a beat. "The rumors about your relationship with your children's caregiver." His PRAD director shook his head sharply, mouthing, "Don't engage." But Julian didn't look at him again. For once, he was tired of hiding, tired of letting half-truths and gossip strip meaning away from the one thing that had brought his family back from the edge. "Yes," Julian said, ignoring the way his PRAD director blanched. "I'd like to comment." Diana blinked in surprise, then adjusted her recorder. "I'll go ahead." Julian inhaled deeply, steadying himself not against fear, but against the weight of what this moment meant. "Sienna Brooks is the reason my sons are healing," he said. "She walked into our home during the worst year of our lives and didn't flinch. She didn't treat my boys like a burden or a tragedy. She treated them like children who deserve joy again. And because of that, they started talking. They started playing. They started laughing." His voice grew stronger with each word. Diana's pen flew across her notebook. "Some people have suggested that her relationship with your family is unconventional," she said cautiously. Julian let out a small, humorless breath. "Some people see a young black woman caring for 3 white children and jump to assumptions. I can't control their biases, but I won't validate them by pretending she's anything other than essential to our lives." His PRAD director rubbed his forehead as if fighting a migraine. Diana leaned in. "So you re-saying her role is not strictly professional?" Julian didn't hesitate. "She is family," he said. "Not as a replacement for Harper. No one could ever replace my wife, but as someone who has become a permanent and deeply important part of our lives." The interview concluded shortly after, but the impact didn't wait. Within hours of publication, the article spread online faster than Julian could refresh his phone. The headline alone stirred reactions nationwide. Tech CEO Julian Hayes defends children's caregiver. She is family. Support poured in from some corners, people admiring his honesty, praising his refusal to bow to prejudice. But just as quickly, backlash swelled. Some accused him of exploiting privilege, others painted Sienna as opportunistic. A few questioned how soon was too soon for a widower to let another woman into his home. The noise was loud, relentless, opinionated in every direction. And yet Julian didn't regret a single word. Still, the consequences came swiftly. Hayes Dynamics board called an emergency meeting the following morning. Julian walked into the conference room to find 12 executives staring at him like he had personally set fire to the building. Charts of social sentiment were projected on the wall. His CFO cleared his throat nervously. "Julian, the optics are challenging." "I don't care about optics," Julian replied. One board member leaned forward. "Your statements may affect investor confidence." "Then let them be affected," Julian said. "I'm not negotiating the happiness of my children for a stock price." The room fell into stunned silence, not the fearful kind, but the kind that comes when a man has already decided he won't ask for permission. When Julian returned home that evening, his nerves tightened again, not because he feared consequences, but because he wasn't sure how much of the chaos Sienna had seen. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with her laptop open. She was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears slipping down her cheeks with a kind of quiet disbelief as she watched the interview play across the screen. Julian's heart clenched. "Sienna," he murmured, stepping closer. She looked up at him, eyes glistening with emotion. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said gently, "I did." "You could lose everything," she said, her voice trembling. "Your company, your reputation, all because of the truth," Julian interrupted softly. She swallowed hard. "And what is that truth, Julian?" he didn't break eye contact, that you matter, that the boys love you. He stopped searching for the right words, not the safe ones, but the real ones. That I won't let anyone treat you like you don't belong here. Her breath hitched, and for the first time, she reached for him. Not tentatively, not politely, she stepped into him and wrapped her arms around him fully, pressing her cheek to his chest as though she had been holding back the instinct for weeks. Julian closed his eyes and held her, not out of obligation or comfort, but out of a deep, unspoken recognition. Two people who had lost too much. Two hearts that had been cracked open in different ways. Two lives that, somehow, had begun stitching themselves together. In that embrace, Julian Hayes understood something with absolute clarity. He hadn't defended Sienna out of guilt. He had defended her because she had become part of his story, a part he wasn't willing to lose. And for the first time in a year, he didn't feel like a man surviving loss. He felt like a man choosing something new. Something real. Something that terrified him, but also gave him the first breath of hope he'd felt in a long, long time. The days following the interview were a whirlwind, far louder, far more aggressive, and far more polarized than Julian had anticipated. He had expected reactions, of course. He had expected disagreements, judgments, scrutiny. What he hadn't expected was the speed with which the story spread across social media, news outlets, gossip forums, and discussion panels. Every opinion imaginable erupted online, supportive ones, hateful ones, curious ones, and some so pointed and personal Julian wondered how people found that level of audacity behind anonymous screens. At first Julian didn't care. He meant what he'd said. He stood by every word. But the noise grew louder by the hour, and the ugliness of it seeped into the corners of his life he wished he could protect, especially the boys and Sienna. For every message praising him for standing up for her, there were comments laced with racism, cynicism, or insinuations that cut deeper than he anticipated. Some targeted Sienna directly, reducing her to stereotypes she didn't deserve. Some accused Julian of replacing Harper, as though love were a resource that only existed in one form at a time. Some targeted the boys, claiming they were being confused or manipulated. Julian read more of it than he should have, and the more he read, the angrier he became. But Sienna, she absorbed the attention in a very different way. In the first few days, she avoided the articles, the interviews, the trending tags. She focused on the boys with the same dedication she always had, pouring her energy into making sure their sense of safety didn't waver. But even through her composure, Julian could see the strain building. It showed in the way she hesitated before stepping into a store, in the way she lowered her voice when strangers lingered nearby, in the way her smiles were still warm, but carried a layer of caution beneath. And Julian hated that for her. He hated that his decision to protect her had also exposed her. One afternoon, he returned home earlier than planned and found Sienna sitting on the back steps overlooking the lawn. The boys were napping inside. She sat with her elbows on her knees, fingers laced together, locket gripped tightly in one hand. He could tell she had been crying, even though her face was dry now. Her posture gave her away, shoulders tight, breath drawn shallow, jaw clenched as though holding herself together required effort. He approached quietly and took a seat beside her on the top step. She didn't look at him at first, but she didn't move away either. "You read something," he said softly. She inhaled, the breath shaky. "You should have warned me." "I didn't know how big it would become," he said honestly. She gave him a tired laugh. "Julian, you billionaire CEO, everything you say becomes big." He rubbed his hand across the back of his neck. "I just meant to tell the truth." "And you did," she said. "But truth comes with weight, and some of it fell on me." He watched her for a moment, trying to gauge whether she was angry, hurt, or simply exhausted. Maybe she was all three. "Tell me what they said," he murmured. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were puffy, rimmed red, but she didn't look defeated. She looked determined, like someone who had fought this battle before and knew how to survive it, even if surviving came at a cost. "People think I'm overstepping, that I'm trying to replace Harper, that I'm using you, using the boys, that I came here with some kind of agenda." Julian clenched his jaw so hard it ached. "We both know none of that is true." "Yes," she said quietly, "but truth doesn't stop people from throwing stones." He hated the tremble in her voice more than anything he'd ever faced in business or life. He wanted to shield her, cut down every cruel word one by one, drag the world into their home to see the reality, see how she loved the boys, how she steadied them, how she held their broken pieces with a gentleness he couldn't replicate. But he couldn't drag the world in. He could only decide what he would do next. "Sienna," he said, turning fully toward her, "I don't want you to feel alone in this, not for a second. You don't have to carry me through it." She whispered, "I want to. That's the part that scares me." Julian's breath stilled. "Why?" She looked down at her hands, thumb brushing over the engraved locket where Willow's name was written. Because when someone starts caring about me, I don't know how to handle it. I don't know what to do with it. And I don't want to become a burden, Julian. He reached out and gently took her hand before she could pull it away. You are not a burden. You are the reason this home feels like a home again. Her breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. But her voice held fear, and what if it becomes too much for you? What if someone convinces you I'm not worth the trouble? Your world is full of people who think they know what's best for you. People with power, with influence, with money. I'm none of those things, Julian, You are exactly who my sons needed, he said, interrupting her. And whether you know it or not, you re exactly who I needed too. A tear slipped down her cheek. He brushed it gently with his thumb. But the attention, she whispered, the negativity. How long can we really live like this? As long as it takes, he said without hesitation. I'm not backing down, not now, not ever. She exhaled slowly. You re not the one strangers are calling names. And you re not the one they expect to stay quiet just to make them comfortable. Julian watched her process that a slow realization that she didn't have to shrink. Didn't have to apologize for existing in a space she had earned through love, not through obligation. The wind rustled through the trees. The yard was calm, unbothered by the chaos outside their walls. Julian found himself wanting to keep this moment, preserve this bubble where the world couldn't touch them. After a long pause, Sienna whispered, I want to stay, I really do. But I don't want the boys to suffer because of me. Julian smiled softly, then stay for them, not because of the noise, not because of the world. Stay because they are better with you here. Stay because they choose you every day. She looked at him again, and he could see it, the slow, reluctant hope forming in her eyes. A hope she didn't trust yet, but wanted to. And what about you, she asked, barely audible. Julian didn't look away. I choose you too. Her breath caught, and for the first time that day, a real smile broke through her grief, small, trembling, but real. Julian felt something in his chest loosen, something long awaited, something warm. He squeezed her hand one more time before rising. Come inside. Dinner's almost ready. The boys asked for you. That made her laugh softly, wiping her face. They always do. And I'm starting to understand why, he said gently. As they walked back into the house together, side by side, Julian realized the storm around them was far from over. The world would keep talking. The criticism would keep coming. Their story would keep spreading in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. But for the first time, he didn't feel afraid of what came next, because Sienna wasn't running, because the boys were starting to heal, because their home, this messy, imperfect, growing home, was stronger than the noise outside it, and because Julian Hayes knew, with a conviction that steadied him, that choosing Sienna was the first choice he'd made in a long time that actually felt like living. The shift didn't happen in a single day. It didn't come with a dramatic moment or a sudden realization. It unfolded slowly, like morning light gradually filling a dark room, until one afternoon, Julian realized his sons were not just growing attached to Sienna. They had already built a place for her in their hearts that went beyond affection. It was belonging, it was trust. It was love in its simplest, purest form. And he hadn't noticed how deeply it ran until he witnessed it with his own eyes. It began on a weekend morning. The kind of morning Harper used to love, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, the scent of maple syrup in the air, boys racing around in mismatched pajamas. Julian had been preparing breakfast when he heard footsteps behind him and turned just in time to see Finn dragging his blanket across the floor, hair tangled, eyes still heavy from sleep. The little boy bypassed Julian entirely and went straight to Sienna, who was standing at the counter peeling bananas. Finn lifted his arms without a word, and Sienna, without hesitation, scooped him into her embrace. He laid his head on her shoulder in a way Julian had not seen since Harper died, trusting, safe. Something inside Julian squeezed sharply, not out of jealousy but out of awe. A connection like that wasn't taught, it wasn't forced. It grew naturally when someone showed up again and again, with patience, with warmth, with a love so steady that even a grieving child recognized it instinctively. Moments later, Caleb and Asher came downstairs arguing about a robot toy, but the moment they spotted Sienna, the argument stopped abruptly. Both boys beamed. Caleb rushed over first, wrapping his arms around her waist, while Asher leaned into her side, quietly murmuring something only she could hear. Julian watched the scene unfold, gripping the edge of the counter as emotions swelled inside him: gratitude, wonder, fear of how much he was beginning to rely on her presence. Sienna was smiling at the boys, brushing their curls away from their foreheads with a tenderness that struck him deeply. She had no idea she was healing wounds she couldn't see. She had no idea she was stitching their world back together with the smallest gestures. And then it happened. Caleb tugged on her arm to get her attention, his face bright and open. "Mama Sienna," he said, voice light and certain. "Can you make the pancakes with the chocolate chips? The way you like them?" Sienna froze. The spatula in her hand stilled. Finn lifted his head from her shoulder. Asher looked from his brother to her with wide eyes. Julian's breath caught painfully, and he felt the world tilt ever so slightly beneath him. The room didn't fall quiet, the boys kept shifting, giggling, but something inside all four adults present shifted dramatically. "Mama Sienna." The words hung in the air like something fragile and holy. Sienna swallowed hard, her eyes widening as if she had been struck by something she didn't know how to process. Her expression flickered shock, heartbreak, tenderness, fear. She lowered Finn slowly to the floor, her hands trembling just a little. "Caleb," she whispered, voice unsteady, "sweetheart, I—" But Caleb interrupted with the unabashed joy of a child who had finally found the name that fit the feeling in his heart. "What? You really like a mama," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world, "a mama who stayed." The last words punctured something deep inside Julian. A mama who stayed. He inhaled sharply, the words hitting a place he had kept locked away for months. Sienna's hand flew to her heart, her face breaking open with an emotion she tried desperately to control. And then Asher stepped forward, tugging gently at her shirt. "Is it okay if we call you that?" he asked, eyes hopeful. "Because we like calling you that." Tears swelled in Sienna's eyes instantly. She dropped to her knees without thinking, wrapping her arms around all three boys as they crowded into her chest. Julian watched her cling to them, as though they were the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. Her shoulders shook as she whispered something he couldn't hear, her forehead pressed to Caleb's temple, one hand cupping Finn's cheek, the other rubbing calming circles into Asher's back. Julian had seen grief, he had lived with it, but this was not grief alone. This was love, raw, terrified, overwhelming love colliding with memories she had desperately tried to protect herself from. He felt his own vision blur. Not because he thought Harper was being replaced, never that, but because he realized something profound. His sons were not losing their mother's memory. They were gaining another heart to hold on to. When Sienna finally looked up at him, tears streaked her cheeks, and her lips trembled with a mixture of apology and awe. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't try to make them." "I know," Julian said softly, "that's why it matters." She stared at him, breathing unevenly. "Julian, what does this mean for them, for us?" It was a question packed with fear, fear of boundaries, fear of judgment, fear of stepping onto ground that would change everything. But Julian didn't hesitate anymore. He knelt beside her, adding his presence to the circle she created with his sons. "It means you refamily," he said simply. "Not because I asked for it, not because they asked for it, but because it happened. Because they chose you, and because you chose them long before you realized it." Sienna covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed. The boys hugged her tighter, as if instinctively sensing she needed grounding. Julian gently pulled her hands away so he could see her eyes. "You don't have to replace Harper. You never could. You never should. But you've given them something they didn't have for a long time, love without fear." Her voice cracked. "I'm scared, Julian." "I know," he whispered, "so am I, but we can be scared together." The boys pressed closer against her, murmuring soft things, little pleas for pancakes, little reassurances that they loved her, little truths that didn't require adult logic to make sense. Sienna kissed the tops of their heads one by one. Julian watched her, his heart tightening in a way that wasn't grief anymore. It was something gentler. Something hopeful. Something that felt like the beginning of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. And as he placed a hand on her back, steadying her as she held his children, Julian understood the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just healing. This wasn't just attachment. This wasn't temporary. His sons had chosen her, and slowly but undeniably he was choosing her too. The idea came to Julian gradually, but once it formed, it rooted itself in his mind with a clarity he hadn't felt since before the accident. Standing in the doorway that morning, watching Sienna hold his sons as tightly as they held her, something became undeniable. Their home had healed enough to breathe again, but the world outside still misunderstood them. People who didn't know them judged, assumed, criticized, invented narratives that made no space for truth. And Julian realized he didn't want to spend the rest of his life fighting rumors. He wanted to build something that spoke louder than gossip, something that honored the two women who shaped him more than anyone ever had. Harper, who gave him 3 sons and taught him how to love with depth. Willow, who shaped Sienna's heart through both joy and loss. 2 lives taken far too soon, yet still leaving behind legacies worth holding on to. And so the Harper and Willow Foundation was born not as a strategy or a symbolic gesture, but as a promise. Promise to his family, a promise to her memory. A promise to the woman standing in his kitchen trying to steady her breath while wiping away tears placed there by love instead of heartbreak this time. He didn't tell Sienna about the project immediately. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because he wanted it to be complete enough for her to understand the depth of his intention. He spent weeks working late into the night not on spreadsheets for Hayes Dynamics or investor decks, but on floor plans, therapy models, pediatric oncology partnerships, architectural sketches. He met with grief counselors, child psychologists, nonprofit advisors, and medical directors. He studied every detail of Willow's treatment with Sienna's permission, wanting to understand the barriers families like hers faced, the costs, the emotional toll, the gaps in support that often left parents feeling more alone than cared for. Julian hadn't built anything this meaningful since the day he started his company. But this time, he wasn't driven by ambition. He was driven by purpose. The idea was simple but powerful: a center for terminally ill children and their families, wrapped in warmth instead of clinical coldness. Counseling rooms that felt like living spaces. Pediatric play areas built outdoors, under the trees, because Julian had learned how healing sunlight could be. Suites for parents who needed to stay near their children without worrying about money. A memorial garden, quiet and green, where love could be remembered without guilt. Programs tailored for grieving siblings, because he knew first than what it was like to watch children shrink under emotions too large for their small bodies. But the most important part was this: Sienna's fingerprints were on every part of the design. Even if she didn't know it, her compassion informed the counseling wing. Her stories of Willow shaped the treatment support programs. Her presence with the boys inspired the family playrooms. Her love, steady, generous, honest, made the entire project pulse with humanity. The foundation building was constructed on a large section of the Hayes estate, where old stables once stood. Julian chose the location because it felt symbolic. A place once meant for shelter was becoming a place for healing. Construction moved faster than expected. Julian spared no expense to ensure it would open before the next winter. Every night, after checking on the boys, he visited the site. He walked the unfinished halls, imagining the families who would one day sit on the couches, the kids who would play in the garden, the laughter that would echo through the rooms built from grief transformed into purpose. He didn't know if the world would understand what he was doing, but he knew Sienna would. She understood loss the way he understood love through scars. The morning he finally took her to see it, he didn't explain where they were going. He just asked her to join him outside after breakfast. She seemed confused but followed him anyway, cheeks still warm from the boys hugging her goodbye before running off to play. They walked side by side across the yard, their steps crunching softly on the gravel path. She looked beautiful in the morning light, hair pulled back, sweater sleeves pushed to her elbows, locket resting against her chest like it always did. She walked with the quiet strength of someone who had lost everything once and still found reasons to stand. When they reached the construction gate, Julian paused. Sienna frowned. "What is this?" "Just come," he said gently. Her breath caught the moment she stepped through. Massive glass windows reflected the sky. Framing beams stretched upward like open arms. Workers moved around them, shaping walls and clearing debris. The early structure resembled a sanctuary more than a facility, warm, modern, full of light. She turned slowly, eyes wide. "Julian, what are you building?" He studied her reaction, not to impress her, but to share something sacred. "A foundation," he said softly. "For families who are fighting battles like the one you fought. A place where parents don't have to feel alone. Where kids have chances to smile even when the world is unkind. Where no one has to choose between hope and grief." Sienna's hands flew to her mouth. Tears welled instantly. He continued, voice low with emotion. "I named it after them, Harper and Willow. 2 names tied to every reason I have for wanting to do better. 2 people who gave you and me our deepest loves and our deepest losses." Tears streamed down Sienna's cheeks freely now. She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. "Julian, this is too much. This is why would you?" "Because you showed me what healing looks like," he said. "Because my sons laugh again. Because you gave them back their childhood. Because you gave me back parts of myself I thought were gone forever." Her knees bent slightly, as though the weight of his words was too much to stand under. Julian stepped closer, gently taking her hands. "This foundation isn't about publicity. It isn't about image. It's about honoring the love that shaped us. And it's about giving families the support we didn't have when we needed it." Her voice cracked. "You built this because of her. Because of my daughter. Because of both of them," he replied. "Harper loved fiercely. Willow fought bravely. This honors them both." She sobbed then quietly, heartbreakingly, not from pain, but from gratitude so deep it unsettled her entire being. Julian held her without hesitation, wrapping his arms around her as her body trembled against him. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It was something bigger, something sacred. two lives intertwined by loss finding purpose in each other's strength. When she finally found her breath, she leaned back enough to look at him through blurred eyes. "You built a legacy," she whispered, "for all of us." Julian lifted her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. "We built it," he corrected, "because none of this would exist without you." More tears fell. More healing happened. More truth settled between them, gentle, undeniable, growing like dawn breaking. And as they stood together in the middle of the foundation's bones, surrounded by the future they were creating, Sienna finally knew something she had doubted for months. She wasn't just a caregiver. She wasn't a shadow in Julian's home. She wasn't temporary. She was part of this family in a way that no rumor, no gossip, no fear could ever undo. The grand opening of the Harper and Willow Foundation arrived on a golden Saturday morning in early spring. The kind of day that felt touched by something bigger than weather. The sky stretched wide and blue over the rebuilt courtyard, sunlight pouring onto the polished stone walkway leading to the foundation's entrance. The building stood proudly, its glass walls reflecting trees just beginning to bloom, its soft architectural curves inviting rather than imposing. It was a place shaped by purpose, by pain transformed into compassion, by love that refused to fade. Guests filled the grounds, donors, families, volunteers, former medical professionals who had supported Julian and Sienna's vision. Reporters stood near the back, their cameras ready, though Julian paid them no mind today. He had long stopped performing for them. Today wasn't about proving himself. Today was about honoring the people who taught him how to rebuild. Julian stood near the edge of the stage, adjusting his tie only because his hands needed something to do. His sons Caleb, Asher, and Finn buzzed around him in suits that made them look impossibly small, their hair neatly combed yet already beginning to go wild in the breeze. They tugged at his jacket, excited and impatient, asking when they could see their game room inside. They'd seen it before, of course, during private tours, but everything felt new today. Everything felt momentous. And then Sienna appeared, walking toward them across the courtyard, wearing a soft cream dress that moved with the wind and caught the light in a way that made Julian's breath catch. She looked elegant, but not in a way that hid her warmth. She walked with the same grounded presence she always carried, steady, humble, full of quiet grace. Her locket rested over her heart, just as it always did, but today it glimmered with something brighter, as if Willow's memory was shining through her. The boys saw her before Julian did. They sprinted toward her, nearly tripping over themselves as they shouted her name. Sienna laughed, bracing herself as three small bodies collided into her legs, hugging her fiercely. She knelt to their height, fixing Caleb's crooked tie, smoothing Asher's hair, and brushing dirt off Finn's knee as if she carried the instinct of a parent in every gesture. Julian watched the scene with an ache so full it felt like gratitude had replaced the air in his lungs. People watched them, some with admiration, some with surprise, some with sentiments he didn't bother deciphering. It didn't matter anymore. Anyone who still questioned Sienna's place in their lives would only have to look once to understand. She wasn't a temporary fixture. She wasn't a professional convenience. She was part of them. She was woven into their days, their laughter, their healing. When it was time for speeches, Julian stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted, though children still whispered to their parents and birds chirped overhead. He took a breath, steady but emotional. He looked at the boys first, then at Sienna standing just beside them. Her eyes already soft with tears she was determined not to let fall. "Thank you all for being here," Julian began. His voice carried easily, strengthened by conviction. This foundation was built for healing. Not just physical healing, but emotional healing. Healing from loss, from fear, from moments when life becomes heavier than we know how to carry. He glanced toward the garden behind the building, where a sculpture of intertwined wings stood at the center, a memorial honoring Harper and Willow. This project began because of two extraordinary people who changed me forever. My wife, Harper Hayes, whose compassion shaped my understanding of love, and Willow Brooks, whose courage shaped the heart of someone who became family to us. Sienna pressed a hand to her chest, her face turning away as if the words were too tender to meet head on. Julian continued, voice steady. "But this foundation also exists because of one remarkable woman who has shown me that grief doesn't end a story, it transforms it. Who taught my sons how to laugh again. Who taught me how to breathe again. Who walked into our lives during the darkest year we've ever known and gifted us light I never thought we'd feel again." Sienna lifted her head, eyes meeting his in a moment so charged the world seemed to fade. He didn't say her name dramatically. He said it gently, reverently, like something sacred. "Sienna Brooks." A soft gasp rolled through the crowd. Reporters lifted their cameras. The boys turned to look at her with pride, as though they had known all along that this moment belongs to her. Julian didn't pause. "This foundation is not mine alone, it is hers as well. Which is why today, I am incredibly honored to announce that Sienna will serve as co-director of the Harper and Willow Foundation. People applauded, some stood. Sienna's hands covered her mouth, her whole body folding as emotion washed over her. Tears glimmered along her cheeks, but her smile bright, trembling, full shone with a depth that nearly knocked Julian off his feet. He continued, knowing the most important words were still to come. And there is one more announcement I want to make publicly, not because it concerns any of you, but because the people who matter most deserve to hear it said clearly. He looked directly at the boys who leaned forward with rapt attention. Then at Sienna. When my wife passed, I feared what would happen to my sons if something ever happened to me. I feared leaving them alone in a world without the people who understood them best. But I don't fear that anymore. He inhaled deeply. His voice didn't tremble. Because if something ever happens to me, Sienna Brooks will be their legal guardian. The boys gasped. Finn turned immediately to Sienna, his face bright with joy. Caleb wrapped his arms around her waist. Asher grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. Sienna stared at Julian, stunned, overwhelmed, visibly breaking open in all the ways healing demands. The applause this time rose like a wave, not polite, not professional, but deeply moved. When the ceremony ended, the boys dragged Sienna toward the playroom inside the foundation, leaving Julian a moment to breathe. He followed them shortly after, but paused in the doorway unnoticed. Sienna sat cross-legged on the floor, the boys already in her lap, climbing and hugging and peppering her with questions. Does this mean you are mama for real? Are we your kids now? Are we a forever family? Sienna laughed through her tears, gathering them close. You've been my family since the day I met you, she said softly, and you always will be. The boys clung to her, small arms wrapped around her neck, their joy erupting in every direction. Julian stepped toward them slowly. Sienna lifted her gaze and smiled at him, soft, glowing, full of gratitude and something deeper that hadn't yet been spoken aloud, but lived between them like breath. He knelt beside her, resting a hand on her back as the boys chattered excitedly. In that simple, perfect moment, surrounded by the sound of his children's laughter and the woman who had stitched their hearts back together, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of pain. Pain would always live somewhere inside him, but peace that allowed joy to stand beside it. The future didn't feel frightening anymore. It felt possible. It felt new. It felt like a beginning. And as Sienna leaned her head gently against his shoulder, Julian understood the truth he had been moving toward all along. Love doesn't replace. Love expands. And theirs was finally large enough to hold everything they'd lost. And everything they were becoming. At its core, the story of Julian, Sienna, and the three boys teaches that healing is neither linear nor predictable, and it rarely arrives in the form we expect. Grief changes people in ways they do not anticipate. It rearranges their worlds, writes their priorities, and sometimes traps them in emptiness long after the world expects them to move on. For Julian, grief had become a quiet shadow that shaped every breath he took. For Sienna, grief was an old wound she had learned to carry without letting it consume her. And for the triplets, grief was a language they had no words for, a weight too heavy for children to understand. Yet when these four lives intersected, something remarkable happened. Each found a type of healing in the presence of the others that they could not find alone. The lesson is clear: people do not recover by pretending they are whole. They recover when someone shows them they are worth rebuilding. Another lesson threaded throughout this story is the truth that love does not diminish when shared, it expands. The boys did not forget Harper because they grew to love Sienna. Their hearts were not replacing memory, they were making room for new connection. Children understand love in a way far simpler and pure than adults do. They do not divide it, ration it, or fear it. They offer it where they feel safe, where they feel held. And their love for Sienna was never a betrayal of their mother. It was a testament to how beautifully Harper had taught to love in the first place. The adult world often tries to impose limits on the heart, insisting that there is one correct way to grieve, one correct way to move forward, one correct way to honor the past. The boys reveal that healing is expansive, not restrictive. Love is not a limited resource. It grows, it adapts, it makes space. Their instinctive affection for Sienna teaches us that love after loss is not disrespectful, it is courageous. This story also explores the idea that family is not just something you are born into. It is something you choose, nurture, and sometimes fight to protect. Julian never intended to rebuild a family. His only goal had been survival, keeping the household functioning, keeping the boys afloat, keeping his grief contained. But Sienna entered their lives with a presence that didn't try to replace what was lost. Instead, she offered steadiness, warmth, and acceptance. She didn't demand spaces, she earned it through patience and authenticity. The foundation of their bond was not obligation but genuine connection. By the time the boys started calling her Mama, it was not because she stepped into Harper's role, it was because she stepped into a space in their hearts that had been waiting for someone who understood what it meant to stay. The lesson here is that family is built on commitment, compassion, and shared vulnerability, not on blood alone. Furthermore, the story challenges our understanding of strength. Julian believed strength meant holding everything together, making decisions alone, and hiding the parts of himself that felt broken. Sienna believed strength meant not burdening others with her past, not letting herself lean on anyone, not risking another loss. But real strength revealed itself in the exact opposite, when they finally allowed themselves to be seen. Strength took shape when Julian stood up publicly to defend Sienna, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Strength emerged when Sienna stayed, even when fear urged her to run. Strength lived in the boys, who dared to love again after losing the person who meant the world to them. This story teaches that strength is not the absence of pain but the courage to move forward while carrying it. A profound lesson also lies in the understanding that healing often demands purpose. Both Julian and Sienna were adrift in their grief, surviving but not living. It wasn't until they created the Harper and Willow Foundation, a sanctuary born from both love and loss, that they discovered how deeply healing it can be to transform personal sorrow into something that uplifts others. Their pain became a catalyst for a legacy that would help countless families. This transformation teaches that grief, when channeled, can become a powerful force for compassion rather than destruction. It reminds us that when life shatters, we are not obligated to rebuild the same shape as before. We are free to create something new, meaningful, and rooted in both memory and hope. Another key lesson is about the courage it takes to challenge societal expectations. Julian and Sienna had to confront prejudice, whispers, judgment, and assumptions from people who saw their relationship through the distorted lens of stereotypes and social hierarchy. Their bond made others uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, but because it defied the roles society prefers to assign. Sienna was young, black, and employed in Julian's home, details some people twisted into narratives meant to diminish her. Yet Julian chose truth over reputation and Sienna chose authenticity over fear. Their story teaches that love, respect, and connection do not need validation from people who do not understand them. Sometimes the bravest act is simply claiming the space in the world that rightfully belongs to you, even when others resist. Finally, the most profound lesson the story offers is this: healing does not erase the past, it builds on it. Julian never stopped loving Harper. Sienna never stopped mourning Willow. The boys never stopped missing their mother. But healing allowed them to honor those memories while creating new ones. The foundation named after Harper and Willow stands as a reminder that loss shapes us but does not define us. Healing is not about forgetting. It is about living fully enough that memory can coexist with hope. This coexistence is not betrayal, it is growth. In the end, the story teaches that love, true love, the patient and expansive kind, can exist even in the aftermath of devastation. It can grow slowly, quietly, unexpectedly. It can heal wounds that seemed unhealable. It can create families where none existed. It can honor those who are gone while embracing those who remain. And it can turn grief into purpose, loneliness into connection, and brokenness into a foundation strong enough to build a future on. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.